Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The fluorescent lights in the Dallas airport terminal were giving me a headache that Thursday morning. I'd been coding for 3 days straight, trying to meet a deadline before this conference in San Diego, and my eyes felt like sandpaper. Working as a software engineer meant long hours, but this project had been particularly brutal. I remember grabbing my third coffee of the morning from the Hudson News, the bitter taste mixing with the anxiety I always felt before flying. At 32, I'd flown maybe 50 times for work, but turbulence still made my palms sweat. The gate agent called for boarding, and I shuffled forward with everyone else, my laptop bag cutting into my shoulder. When I scanned my boarding pass, the machine beeped differently than usual, and the agent smiled at me. "Mr. Harrison, you've been upgraded to an exit row seat. More legroom for you today." I settled into seat 14F, right next to the emergency exit door. The extra space was nice. I could actually stretch my legs without hitting the seat in front of me. A flight attendant named Cheryl, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, ran through the special exit row instructions with me and the other passengers in the row. She had this way of speaking that made you pay attention, like a strict but caring grandmother. I nodded along, half listening while I pulled out my phone to check one last email. The plane filled up quickly, business travelers and families heading west for the weekend. Next to me sat an older gentleman in a Navy veteran cap who introduced himself as Walter, and across the aisle was a young mother named Jessica with her teenage daughter. We all made that awkward small talk you do when you know you'll be sitting inches from strangers for the next 3 hours. The pilot came on the intercom just as we pushed back from the gate, his voice carrying that practiced calm all pilots seem to have. Then the plane stopped moving. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We're experiencing a minor mechanical issue with one of our hydraulic systems. Nothing to worry about, but we need to return to the gate for a quick inspection. Should only be about 15 minutes. Famous last words. 15 minutes turned into 30, then 45. The air in the cabin grew thick and stale as we sat there with the engines off. People started getting restless, pulling out phones, shifting in their seats. Walter told me about his time on aircraft carriers, how this was nothing compared to landing on a ship in rough seas. Jessica's daughter, who couldn't have been more than 14, kept asking her mom questions about the delay. I tried to focus on my laptop reviewing code, but something kept nagging at me. The maintenance crew outside my window seemed rushed, almost frantic. One technician kept pointing at something under the wing, shaking his head. After an hour and 20 minutes, the captain came back on. "We've completed our inspection and been cleared for departure. Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff." The engines roared to life again, but this time something sounded different. Wasn't quite right. Like when your car makes that noise, you know you should get checked, but you ignore because you need to get to work. The pitch was uneven, cycling up and down in a way that made my chest tight. I glanced at Walter, who had stopped mid-sentence in his story about the Pacific. He heard it too. As we taxied back to the runway, I noticed Cheryl walking through the cabin one more time, checking seatbelts and tray tables. When she passed our row, she paused for just a second at my exit door, her fingers brushing against the handle mechanism. Her face stayed professional, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. She moved on quickly, but that moment stuck with me. The vibration started as soon as we hit full throttle for takeoff. Not the normal rumble you feel during acceleration, but something deeper, traveling up through the floor into my feet. It felt wrong, like standing too close to heavy machinery that's about to break. We lifted off, and Dallas disappeared beneath us. For the first 20 minutes, I almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. The vibration settled into a rhythm, still there but consistent enough to ignore if you tried hard enough. I put my headphones on and attempted to lose myself in a podcast about machine learning, but I kept pulling them off to listen. Walter had fallen asleep, his head tilted back and mouth slightly open. Jessica was helping her daughter with homework, normal life continuing around me while this unease gnawed at my gut. The flight attendants served drinks, people watched movies on their tablets. Everything seemed routine, but that vibration never stopped, and every few minutes the engine noise would spike, like someone revving a motorcycle engine randomly. I found myself gripping the armrests during those moments, my knuckles white against the worn fabric. The woman in front of me kept turning around, and I realized she felt it too. We made eye contact once, and I saw my own worry reflected in her face. Then it happened. 31 minutes after takeoff, according to my phone. The bang was so loud it felt like someone had fired a cannon next to my head. The entire plane lurched sideways, throwing people against their seats. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like yellow jellyfish, dangling and swaying as the plane shuddered. The lights flickered and went out, emergency lighting casting everything in a sickly green glow. Screams erupted throughout the cabin, raw and primal. Walter jerked awake, his military training kicking in as he immediately reached for his mask. Jessica pulled her daughter close, both of them fumbling with their masks while tears streamed down the girl's face. My own mask hung in front of me, and I grabbed it with trembling fingers, pulling it over my face. The plastic smelled like dust and fear. Captain Reynolds' voice crackled through the speakers, no longer calm. Emergency descent, brace positions, flight attendants secure the cabin. The plane nosed down hard and my stomach lurched up into my throat. Through the chaos, I heard a sound that made everything else fade away. A high-pitched whistle coming from right beside me. The whistle was coming from the exit door. Around the edges where the door met the frame, I could see daylight. Actual daylight, where there should have been an airtight seal. The door was bowing outward slightly, flexing with the pressure difference. My mind raced through the exit row briefing, but nothing had prepared me for this. The whistling grew louder as we descended, air screaming through the gaps. I pressed my hand against the door and felt it vibrating, the metal cold even through the chaos of the moment. Walter saw what I was doing and his face went pale beneath his oxygen mask. He pointed at the door, and then at me, his eyes asking a question I didn't know how to answer. The plane continued its steep descent, and I could feel the pressure building in my ears despite the oxygen flowing. People were crying, praying, holding each other. A man 2 rows up was recording a message on his phone for his family, but all I could focus on was that door, watching it flex and strain against its failing seal. Cheryl appeared in the aisle, moving with impossible grace despite the plane's violent descent. She took one look at the door and her professional mask finally cracked. Real fear flashed across her face before she composed herself. She leaned close to me, having to shout over the noise. "The seal is failing. If it blows at this altitude..." She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. We both knew what would happen. The sudden decompression would be catastrophic, especially for those seated near the exit. She grabbed my shoulders, her grip surprisingly strong. "There's an emergency kit under your seat, red handle. When I tell you, you need to help me." She turned to Walter and Jessica. "You 3 need to move, now, as far back as you can." But Jessica's daughter was frozen in terror, her mask not properly sealed, starting to hyperventilate. Jessica was trying to fix it, but her own panic was making her fingers clumsy. Walter started to unbuckle to help them, but the plane hit turbulence and slammed him back into his seat. I made a decision that still haunts me. Instead of reaching for the emergency kit, I unbuckled and lunged across the aisle to Jessica's daughter. The plane was bouncing like a mechanical bull, and I slammed my shoulder hard into the overhead bin. Pain shot through my arm, but I ignored it, grabbing the girl's mask and adjusting the elastic straps with steady movements I didn't know I possessed. "Breathe with me," I told her, exaggerating my own breath so she could see through the clear plastic. "In through your nose, out through your mouth, just like in gym class." Something about the mundane comparison broke through her panic. She started matching my rhythm, her eyes locked on mine. Walter had managed to get free and was helping Jessica with her seatbelt. The whistling from the door had become a shriek, and I could see the gap widening. Maybe a 1/4 inch now, but at 20,000 feet that was enough to kill us all if it gave way completely. Cheryl was on her radio, speaking rapidly to the cockpit. her free hand pressed against the door as if she could hold it closed through sheer will. 8 minutes to 10,000 feet, Cheryl announced, and I knew she was telling us how long we had to live if the door held. She looked at me, then at the emergency kit I hadn't retrieved. Now or never. I left Jessica's daughter with her mother and dove back to my seat, finding the red handle under the cushion. The kit was heavier than expected, a metal box that clanged open to reveal industrial-strength adhesive strips, a manual pressure gauge, and something that looked like an inflatable seal. Cheryl's hands moved with practiced efficiency, showing me how to apply the adhesive strips along the door frame. The temperature difference between inside and outside made the metal burn cold, and the adhesive barely wanted to stick. We worked in sections, me holding the strips in place while she activated some kind of chemical reaction that made them expand and harden. The whistling didn't stop, but it changed pitch, becoming lower, less urgent. My fingers were numb by the time we'd done 3 edges. The 4th edge, the one taking the most stress, was where things went wrong. As I pressed the strip into place, the door lurched outward another half-inch with a metallic groan that sounded like a death rattle. "Hold it!" Cheryl shouted, and we both threw our body weight against the door. I could feel it pushing back, the pressure difference trying to rip it from its hinges. The inflatable seal was our last option. Cheryl pulled it out, a thick rubber tube with a CO2 cartridge attached. She jammed it into the growing gap, right where the door was failing worst, and pulled the activation cord. The seal expanded with a hiss, fighting against the escaping air. For a moment, I thought it would work. The whistling decreased, the door stopped moving. Then the plane hit another pocket of turbulence, a violent drop that lifted us off our feet. When we slammed back down, I heard the worst sound of my life, the crack of metal fatigue. The door frame itself was failing, not just the seal. Bolts were stripping from their housings, visible through the interior panel. I looked at Cheryl and saw the same realization in her eyes. We had minutes, maybe less. She grabbed her radio again. "Captain, we need to descend faster. Exit door catastrophic failure imminent." The response was immediate. The plane's nose dropped even steeper, and I had to brace myself against the seats to keep from falling forward. 4 minutes, Captain Reynolds' voice came through the speakers, barely audible over the screaming wind and terrified passengers. 4 minutes might as well have been 4 hours. The door was bowing out visibly now, the center bulging like a balloon about to pop. Walter had gotten Jessica and her daughter moved back 6 rows, but in a packed plane, that wasn't nearly far enough if explosive decompression happened. I made another choice then, one that went against every instinct of self-preservation. I wedged myself between the door and the seat, using my back as a brace. The cold was incredible, seeping through my shirt like ice water. Cheryl saw what I was doing and positioned herself next to me, both of us becoming human reinforcements for failing metal. She started talking, maybe to distract us both from what might happen. 23 years I've been flying, never had a door fail. You're doing good, Harrison, just hold on. The vibration through my back was getting worse, each shake of the plane threatening to be the one that sent us into the sky. I could hear rivets popping like firecrackers. 3 minutes. 2 minutes. The altitude alarm was beeping somewhere, mixing with all the other chaos into a symphony of disaster. Then, just as I felt the door shift against my spine in a way that meant it was about to go, everything changed. The pressure in my ears popped so hard, I thought my eardrums had burst. But it wasn't the door failing. We'd broken through 10,000 feet. The stress on the door decreased dramatically, like someone had turned off a switch. The bulge flattened, the whistling dropped to a whisper. Cheryl and I stayed pressed against it, not trusting the sudden reprieve, as Captain Reynolds brought us down toward San Diego. Those last 15 minutes felt like a lifetime. When the wheels finally touched runway, the entire plane erupted in applause and sobs. Emergency vehicles surrounded us before we'd even stopped rolling. They evacuated us through the other exits, keeping everyone away from our damaged door. As I stepped onto the tarmac, my legs nearly gave out. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me shaky and exhausted. Cheryl found me by the ambulance where they were checking everyone for hypoxia. She hugged me, this woman I'd never met before today, and whispered "thank you" in my ear. The NTSB investigation later found that improper maintenance during our delay had damaged the door seal, and the pressure differential at cruise altitude had nearly caused catastrophic failure. I still fly for work, though I always check my seat assignment now. Exit rows don't appeal to me anymore. Sometimes I wake up at night, feeling that cold pressure against my back, hearing those rivets pop. But I also remember Jessica's daughter breathing steadily behind her mask, Walter's calm military bearing as he helped evacuate people, and Cheryl's steady hands as we fought to keep death at bay with adhesive strips and determination. The report said we were 43 seconds from total door failure when we hit safe altitude. 43 seconds. I've lived a lot of life in those seconds since then, and I don't take any of them for granted. They offered me compensation, counseling, even first-class upgrades for life. I took the counseling. The therapist helped me understand that the choice to stay and help wasn't reckless. It was human. We're wired to help each other when things go wrong, even when it might cost us everything. That door never did blow out, but it opened something in me. Now when I code, when I solve problems for a living, I remember that sometimes the solution isn't elegant or pretty. Sometimes it's just holding on with everything you've got until you reach safe ground. The exhaustion was already setting in when I settled into seat 23F on that November red-eye from Seattle to Atlanta. I worked as a medical equipment sales rep back in 2017, constantly bouncing between cities, living out of Marriott hotels and surviving on airport food. At 34, the job paid well enough to keep my downtown Seattle apartment and help with my sister's college tuition, but the travel was wearing me down. That particular Tuesday, I'd wrapped up 3 back-to-back presentations at Harborview Medical Center and barely made it to SeaTac for the 11:45 p.m. departure. The plane was maybe half full, mostly business travelers like me. Everyone ready to sleep through the 5-hour flight. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have an empty middle seat next to me, already planning to stretch out once we hit cruising altitude. The guy across the aisle caught my attention before we even pushed back from the gate. Aisle seat 23C, wearing a wrinkled gray suit that looked like he'd been sleeping in it for days. What struck me wasn't his disheveled appearance. We all looked rough on these late flights. But the way he kept checking his phone, then his watch, then the overhead bins like he was timing something. His carry-on was this beat-up leather messenger bag that he clutched between his feet instead of stowing it properly. Mid-40s maybe, thinning brown hair that stuck up at odd angles, and these intense green eyes that seemed to catalog every person who walked past. The flight attendant, a patient woman named Brenda according to her name tag, asked him twice to put his bag in the overhead compartment. Both times he just nodded and smiled, but never moved it. I figured he was just another anxious flyer. Maybe he had important documents or medication he wanted to keep close. God knows I'd seen plenty of nervous passengers over the years. We took off without incident, and I popped in my earbuds, ready to zone out to some podcast about real estate investing. About an hour in, somewhere over eastern Washington, I noticed the guy had started talking, not on his phone, just talking. His lips were moving in this rapid, quiet way, like he was reciting something from memory. The woman in front of him turned around once, probably wondering if he was talking to her, but he didn't even notice. His eyes were fixed on the seat back in front of him, and his fingers were tapping out some kind of rhythm on his armrest. I pulled out one earbud, curious despite myself. Couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was weird. Not like normal speech, more like he was counting or doing math problems out loud. The flight attendants were doing their beverage service, and when Brenda reached our row, she paused, watching him with this concerned expression. That's when things started getting uncomfortable. His quiet muttering gradually increased in volume, and I could finally make out fragments. Carry the 7, altitude minus time. They changed it at 12:47. He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket and started scribbling furiously, numbers and symbols that made no sense from where I sat. A businessman 2 rows up turned around with an annoyed look, and I saw Brenda whisper something to another flight attendant near the galley. The second attendant, a younger guy with a crew cut, walked over casually, like he was just checking on passengers. He leaned down and spoke quietly to the man, who suddenly stopped writing and looked up at him with this expression of pure confusion, like he'd just woken up from a dream. "Sir, is everything all right?" the attendant asked, loud enough for me to hear. The man blinked several times, then smiled, but it was wrong somehow, too wide, showing too many teeth. "Everything's perfect," he said. "We're right on schedule." Then he went back to his notebook, muttering even louder than before. 20 minutes later, he was standing in the aisle, pointing at random passengers and announcing observations that made my skin crawl. "You're not supposed to be here," he told a teenage girl 3 rows ahead. "Your ticket says Phoenix." The girl's mother pulled her closer, looking terrified. The crew cut attendant approached again, more firmly this time, but the man just laughed. "Don't you see what they're doing?" he asked, gesturing wildly at the cockpit door. "We're not going to Atlanta. Check your phones, check the GPS. We've been circling for an hour." I actually did check my phone then, even though I knew it was ridiculous. We were still on airplane mode, obviously, but that seed of doubt he'd planted was already growing. Other passengers were shifting in their seats, some pulling out their devices too. The strange thing was, when I looked out the window, I couldn't see any city lights below us anymore. Just darkness. But that was normal for flying over unpopulated areas, I told myself. Totally normal. The situation deteriorated fast after that. He started going row by row, leaning over seats, asking people for their boarding passes. "Show me," he'd demand. "Show me where it says Atlanta." When an elderly man in a veteran's cap refused, the guy grabbed his shoulder, not violently, but with this desperate urgency that was somehow worse. "They switched the manifests," he insisted. "Can't you feel it? The pressure's all wrong, we're descending." That's when Brenda and 2 other attendants converged on him, trying to guide him back to his seat. But he twisted away, surprisingly agile for someone who'd seemed so unsteady. "I have to check something," he announced, and before anyone could stop him, he was moving toward the rear of the plane, that messenger bag bouncing against his hip. The attendants followed, trying to look calm, but I could see the tension in their shoulders. Then he disappeared into the lavatory and locked the door. What followed were the longest 15 minutes of my life. The flight attendants huddled near the locked door, speaking in hushed tones with the cockpit through their handsets. I could hear muffled sounds from inside the lavatory, metal clanking, something being unscrewed, and that continuous muttering. The other passengers were fully awake now, craning their necks to see what was happening. A woman across from me was quietly crying, and her husband kept telling her it would be okay, but his voice had no conviction. The plane hit some turbulence then, just normal bumps, but in that charged atmosphere it felt sinister. The crew cut attendant knocked on the door repeatedly. "Sir, you need to come out now. Sir?" No response except for more mechanical sounds. Then suddenly, the smoke alarm in the lavatory went off. Not just a beep, a full shrieking wail that cut through the cabin. But here's the thing that still bothers me. There was no smell of smoke, nothing burning, just that piercing alarm that wouldn't stop. The captain's voice came over the intercom, professionally calm, but with an edge I'd never heard before in all my years of flying. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor technical issue. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." But I could see Brenda's face, and it wasn't showing minor technical issue. It was showing barely controlled panic. The attendants had produced some kind of tool and were working on the lavatory door lock while the alarm continued its assault on our ears. When they finally got it open, the alarm cut off instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. All 3 attendants crowded around the doorway, blocking our view, but I heard the crew cut guy say, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. Then Brenda stepped back, and for just a second I could see inside. The man was sitting on the closed toilet lid, completely calm now, hands folded in his lap. But the small mirror above the sink had been removed, and through the opening I could see exposed wires and tubes. Some of them had been cut. Others were connected to something I couldn't identify, something from his messenger bag. "I fixed it," he said, his voice eerily serene. "The deviation was at 217. We're back on course now." The crew cut attendant grabbed his arm to pull him out, but the man didn't resist. He stood up slowly, like he was in no hurry, and that's when I noticed his hands. They were covered in what looked like hydraulic fluid, dark and oily, and there were small cuts all over his palms, like he'd been handling something sharp without caring about injury. As they led him past my row, he looked directly at me, and I'll never forget what he said. "Check your compass when you land. Magnetic north isn't where they told you it would be." His green eyes were completely lucid, not a trace of the mania from before. That somehow made it worse. They seated him up front where they could watch him, zip-tying his wrist to the armrest, but he didn't struggle. Just sat there with his eyes closed, lips moving in that same rhythmic pattern from earlier. The captain announced we'd be making an emergency landing in Denver, but that took another hour, the longest hour I've ever experienced. The whole time I kept thinking about those cut wires, wondering what systems they connected to, what he might have actually done in there. The other passengers were silent, that kind of thick quiet that happens when everyone's scared but trying not to show it. I noticed people kept checking their phones, even though we had no signal, looking for something, anything, to verify we were where we should be. The flight attendant stayed near the man, but he never moved, never opened his eyes. About 20 minutes before landing, something else happened that I've never told anyone until now. All our phones, every single one in the cabin, suddenly showed the same time, 2:17 a.m., even though it should have been close to 4 a.m. by then. The businessman 2 rows up gasped. The crying woman let out a little shriek, and I just stared at my screen, watching the numbers refuse to change. Then, just as suddenly, they all jumped to the correct time, like whatever interference had been affecting them just stopped. We landed in Denver without incident, and the police were waiting on the tarmac. They took the man away first, still completely docile, still with that unsettling calm. As he passed my row one last time, he opened his eyes and looked at me. "You'll thank me later," he whispered, "when you see the news about Atlanta." The FBI agents who boarded next spent 2 hours questioning all of us, taking our phones to check for evidence, examining that lavatory with equipment I'd never seen before. They wouldn't tell us what they found, just kept asking about what exactly we'd heard him say, what we'd seen him do. The agent who interviewed me, a woman with prematurely gray hair and tired eyes, seemed particularly interested in his comments about magnetic north and the time deviation. She made me repeat those parts 3 times, taking careful notes. When I asked if we were ever in actual danger, she just said, "We're investigating all possibilities." Here's the thing that haunts me. There was no news about Atlanta. Nothing happened there that night or the next day or ever. Whatever the man thought he was preventing, it either never existed or he actually prevented it. I've checked flight records since then, and our flight path that night shows some weird anomalies, little deviations that air traffic control can't explain, moments where we seem to be in 2 places at once according to radar. The airline sent us all apology letters and flight vouchers, but no explanation. I tried to find out what happened to the man, but hit dead ends everywhere. The FBI file is sealed, the airline won't comment, and none of the other passengers I've tried to contact will talk about it. But sometimes when I'm on a red-eye flight and we hit turbulence, I check my phone's compass. And twice, just twice, I've seen it pointing somewhere it shouldn't. Both times I've thought about those cut wires, those numbers he was muttering, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, he really was trying to stop something. Something that's still out there, waiting for the right flight, the right time. I don't fly red-eyes anymore. You know that feeling when you're running on 3 hours of sleep and your third cup of coffee isn't doing its job anymore? That was me on Friday morning, April 15, 2022, standing in the cramped terminal of Cedar Rapids Regional Airport. I'm a freelance journalist, and I'd been chasing a story about municipal corruption in Iowa for the past week. The kind of small-town scandal that pays the bills but drains your soul. I was supposed to catch a 7:45 a.m. connecting flight to Chicago, then home to Portland. The terminal was practically empty except for a handful of business travelers and an elderly couple arguing about their boarding passes. I remember thinking how different these tiny Midwest airports felt compared to the chaos of LAX or JFK. There was something almost quaint about the whole setup, with its outdated carpet and the single coffee stand run by a woman who looked like she'd been there since the airport opened. The fog outside was thick as soup that morning, the kind that makes you question whether planes should even be flying. I pressed my face against the terminal window, watching the runway lights disappear into a gray void about 50 feet out. The departure board kept flashing delayed for most flights, but somehow mine was still showing on time. I'd been traveling for work for 8 years, and I'd seen my share of weather delays, but this felt different. The fog seemed to swallow everything whole, and I couldn't even make out the wingtips of the planes parked at the gates. A maintenance guy walked past with a radio crackling static, and I caught fragments of conversations about visibility and ground stops. Part of me hoped they'd cancel the flight so I could grab a hotel room and sleep for 12 hours straight, but I had a deadline looming and my editor was already breathing down my neck about expenses. When they finally called for boarding, I was genuinely surprised. The gate agent, a middle-aged guy with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous tick of adjusting his tie, kept glancing toward the windows as he scanned our boarding passes. "Beautiful morning for flying," he said to each passenger, but his voice had that forced cheerfulness you hear from people trying to convince themselves everything's fine. The plane was a small regional jet, maybe 40 seats total, and it felt even tinier as we filed down the narrow aisle. I grabbed a window seat about halfway back, hoping to catch some sleep during the short hop to Chicago. The woman across from me was clutching her armrest and muttering prayers under her breath. 2 rows up, a businessman in a rumpled suit was typing frantically on his laptop, probably trying to squeeze in some work before takeoff. The flight attendant, a young woman named Kimberly according to her name tag, was going through the safety demonstration with practiced efficiency, but I noticed she kept glancing toward the cockpit door. The pilot's voice came over the intercom with that standard pre-flight greeting, but there was something strained about it. Captain Hendricks, he said his name was, and he mentioned the fog but assured us it was within acceptable limits for departure. "We'll have you in Chicago in about an hour and 15 minutes, he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. As we taxied away from the gate, I could feel the plane moving slowly, almost hesitantly. The engines spooled up and down like the pilots were having second thoughts. Through my window, I watched the terminal building disappear into the gray wall of fog, and then there was nothing but white. No runway lights, no ground crew. Nothing. Just the sound of engines and the low hum of conversations from nervous passengers. I pulled out my phone to check the time and noticed I still had a decent signal, so I started scrolling through emails to distract myself from the growing unease that was settling in my chest. We sat at what I assumed was the end of the runway for what felt like forever. The fog was so thick, I couldn't see the wingtip lights, and the only indication we were still on the ground was the occasional bump from the landing gear rolling over runway joints. I could hear the pilots talking through the thin cockpit door, their voices muffled but urgent. Words like visibility minimums and tower clearance drifted back to us. The businessman 2 rows up had closed his laptop and was now staring out his window, with the same confused expression I probably had. Kimberly walked up and down the aisle, checking seatbelts and overhead bins, but her movements were more mechanical than usual, like she was going through the motions to keep herself busy. The elderly couple from the terminal was seated near the front, and I could hear the woman asking her husband if this was normal. His reassuring murmur didn't sound particularly convincing. Then the engines roared to life with the intensity that made the whole cabin vibrate. We were moving, picking up speed fast, and I pressed my face to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, through the fog. The acceleration felt normal at first, that familiar push back into your seat as the plane builds momentum, but then I noticed we were moving for longer than usual. Most regional jets lift off pretty quickly, but we kept rolling and rolling. The woman across from me had her eyes squeezed shut, and her knuckles were white from gripping the armrest. I started to wonder if we were on a longer runway than I thought, or if the pilots were being extra cautious because of the visibility. The sound of the engines changed pitch, and I could feel us starting to rotate, that moment when the nose lifts, and you know you're about to leave the ground. Relief washed over me as I felt the familiar sensation of the wheels leaving pavement. But then, everything went wrong at once. There was this horrible scraping sound, like metal being dragged across concrete, and the plane lurched violently to the right. My shoulder slammed into the window as we banked so hard, I thought we might roll completely over. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swaying wildly as the aircraft shuddered and bucked like it was fighting to stay airborne. Someone screamed near the front of the cabin, and I could hear loose items crashing around in the overhead bins. The businessman's laptop went flying across the aisle, and the elderly woman was crying out for her husband. Through the chaos, I could hear Captain Hendricks on the intercom, his voice tight and controlled but clearly stressed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a mechanical issue during takeoff. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we assess the situation." The plane kept banking right, far beyond what felt safe, and I could feel us losing altitude even though we'd barely gotten off the ground. The cabin pressure started dropping almost immediately. My ears popped painfully, and I could taste that metallic tang in the air that meant trouble. Kimberly was struggling to move down the aisle, grabbing seatbacks for support as the plane continued its erratic flight path. Her face was pale, and she kept looking toward the cockpit like she was waiting for instructions that weren't coming. I pulled out my phone and started recording without really thinking about it, journalist instincts kicking in even when I was terrified. The video shows everything shaking violently, passengers reaching for oxygen masks, and through my window, just gray fog and the occasional flash of what might have been ground lights far below. Captain Hendricks came back on the speaker. "We may have departed from an incorrect runway and sustained damage during takeoff. We're working to stabilize the aircraft." His words sent a chill through the cabin that had nothing to do with the failing pressurization. Wrong runway? How do you take off from the wrong runway? The smell of fuel started seeping into the cabin, sharp and acrid, making several passengers gag. That's when real panic set in. The woman across from me was hyperventilating into her oxygen mask, and the businessman was frantically texting someone, probably his family. I kept my phone recording, though my arms were shaking so badly the footage was probably useless. Through the speaker system, we could hear fragments of radio chatter between the pilots and air traffic control. Words like fuel leak, hydraulic pressure, and emergency landing filtered through the static. The plane was still banking right, but not as severely now, and I could feel the pilots fighting to bring us level. Captain Hendricks announced we were returning to Cedar Rapids for an emergency landing, but his voice cracked slightly when he said it. The fog was still so thick outside that I couldn't see anything to orient myself, just endless gray, punctuated by the occasional warning light blinking on the wing. Kimberly managed to make it to the front of the cabin and grabbed the PA system. Her voice was steadier than I expected as she walked us through emergency landing procedures, but I could see her jaw trembling. "In the event of an emergency landing, assume the brace position," she said, demonstrating with her arms over her head. The elderly couple was holding each other, and the man kept repeating, "It's going to be okay, Margaret. It's going to be okay," like a mantra. I realized I was still recording and tried to keep the camera steady, capturing the chaos around me. Part of my brain was thinking about the story this would make, assuming we survived to tell it, but mostly I was just trying to process what the captain had said about clipping something during takeoff. In the fog, on the wrong runway, what could we have hit? Another plane? A building? The thought made my stomach lurch worse than the turbulence. The emergency landing was rougher than anything I'd ever experienced, but Captain Hendricks somehow managed to get us down in one piece. We hit the runway hard, bounced twice, and I could hear the emergency brakes screaming as we skidded to a stop. Fire trucks and ambulances were already waiting, their red and blue lights cutting through the fog like beacons. The evacuation was orderly but tense, with passengers sliding down the emergency chutes onto the wet tarmac. I kept my phone in my pocket during the chaos, but I could feel it there, heavy with the footage I'd recorded. EMTs checked everyone over, and miraculously nobody was seriously injured. Just some bruises from the rough landing and a few cases of shock. The elderly woman, Margaret, had a panic attack and was taken to the hospital as a precaution. But overall, we'd gotten incredibly lucky. As we waited in the terminal for statements and rebooking, I overheard one of the investigators talking to Captain Hendricks about how they'd somehow ended up on a maintenance runway that should have been closed. 3 days later, when I finally made it home to Portland, I sat down to review the footage on my phone. Most of it was shaky and chaotic, just what you'd expect from someone recording during an aviation emergency. But as I scrubbed through the video frame by frame looking for usable material for the article I was writing, I found something that made my breath catch in my throat. Right at the moment of impact, when we hit whatever we hit during takeoff, there was a brief clearing in the fog. Just for a second, maybe two, the camera captured something through the window. At first, I thought it was debris or part of the runway equipment. But when I enhanced the image and slowed it down, the shape became unmistakable. It was a person, a figure in what looked like orange coveralls, the kind maintenance crews wear. They were standing right in our path, and in that split second of visibility, I could see them turning toward the sound of our engines. The impact happened so fast, but the footage shows the moment of contact, and then they were gone. The investigation concluded we'd struck a fuel truck that had been left on the maintenance runway, but I never told anyone what I saw in that video. Sometimes I wonder if I should have, but what would I say? That we didn't just hit equipment. We hit someone who shouldn't have been there. I deleted the footage and never wrote the article. Some stories are too heavy to carry. Flight 447 to Las Vegas should have been just another routine trip. I was heading out there for my old unit's annual reunion, bunch of retired federal air marshals getting together to swap stories and complain about our knees. At 62, I'd been out of the game for 3 years, but old habits die hard. Even in civilian clothes, I still found myself automatically scanning faces, noting exit rows, checking for anything that seemed out of place. My wife always said I'd never truly retire from being hypervigilant, and she was probably right. The boarding process went smoothly enough, typical Friday afternoon crowd heading to Sin City for the weekend. I'd managed to snag an aisle seat about halfway down the cabin, perfect spot to observe without being obvious about it. The flight attendants were going through their usual routine, that rehearsed safety demonstration that most passengers ignored while scrolling through their phones. I noticed 2 men in the back rows, probably around row 28 or 29, both wearing these thick winter jackets that seemed completely unnecessary for an August flight. The cabin temperature was comfortable, maybe even a bit warm. But these guys were bundled up like it was January in Minnesota. One was tall and lanky with close-cropped brown hair, the other shorter and stockier with a patchy beard. Nothing inherently suspicious about that. People dress weird on flights all the time, but it caught my attention anyway. About 30 minutes into the flight, when we'd reached cruising altitude and most people had settled into their routines, I noticed the tall one lean over to his companion. He pulled out what appeared to be a small piece of paper from his jacket pocket and discreetly handed it over. The exchange was subtle, almost rehearsed, like they'd practiced it. The shorter guy read whatever was written, nodded once, then carefully folded the note and slipped it into his own pocket. They weren't talking, weren't making eye contact with anyone else, just sitting there in their oversized jackets while everyone around them was in t-shirts and light clothing. My training kicked in automatically. Pattern recognition, threat assessment, all those instincts I'd honed over more than 2 decades of flying with potential dangers. The thing that really started bothering me was how they kept glancing toward the front of the cabin. Not casual looks, but deliberate, measuring glances toward the cockpit area and the galley where the flight attendants were preparing the beverage service. Every few minutes, one of them would crane his neck slightly, like he was timing something or memorizing the crew's movements. The tall one had this nervous energy about him, his leg bouncing constantly, fingers drumming against his armrest in a rhythm that seemed too deliberate. Meanwhile, his partner remained completely still, almost unnaturally calm, staring straight ahead with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that retirement had made me jumpy, but every fiber of my being was screaming that these two were planning something. I found myself debating whether to alert the crew. Problem was, I had no official authority anymore, just a retired federal employee with a gut feeling and some suspicious observations. What was I supposed to tell them? 2 guys in jackets passed a note and keep looking forward? That would sound ridiculous, especially coming from someone who wasn't even supposed to be paying that kind of attention to other passengers. But my instincts had kept me alive through countless flights, including 3 real incidents where things went sideways fast. I'd learned to trust that nagging feeling in my chest, that electric tension that meant danger was brewing. The flight attendants were completely oblivious, chatting among themselves as they rolled the beverage cart down the aisle, smiling at passengers and asking about drink preferences like it was any other routine flight. Then things escalated in a way that made my decision for me. Both men suddenly stood up simultaneously, moving with a coordination that was definitely not coincidental. The tall one reached into his jacket, not in a rushed or obvious way, but with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested he was accessing something specific. They started walking toward the front of the cabin, not hurrying but moving with purpose, weaving between passengers who were getting up to use the restroom or stretch their legs. I watched as they approached the galley area where 2 flight attendants were preparing the next round of service. The crew members noticed them coming, but didn't seem alarmed yet. Just 2 passengers probably asking for extra peanuts or complaining about the temperature. But I could see the tension in both men's postures, the way they kept their jacket pockets positioned just so, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was about to happen wasn't going to be a routine passenger request. I unbuckled my seatbelt as quietly as possible and started moving forward, staying low and using other passengers as cover. My heart was pounding, but my mind was crystal clear. That familiar state of heightened awareness that had gotten me through dangerous situations before. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her 40s with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, finally noticed the approaching men and stepped forward to intercept them. She had that practiced customer service smile, the kind flight crews use to diffuse situations before they escalate. "Gentlemen, can I help you with something?" she asked, positioning herself between them and the cockpit door. The tall one mumbled something I couldn't quite hear from my position, but his body language was all wrong, too rigid, too focused. His companion hung back slightly, creating what I recognized as a tactical formation. The blonde attendant's expression shifted from polite curiosity to concern as the tall man continued speaking in low, urgent tones. She glanced back toward her colleague, a younger guy with dark hair who was still organizing the beverage cart, clearly trying to signal for backup without alarming the other passengers. That's when the shorter man with the beard stepped closer, effectively boxing in the flight attendant between the 2 of them. The dynamic changed instantly. What had looked like a conversation was now clearly a confrontation. Other passengers were starting to notice, heads turning, conversations dropping to whispers. The cabin's atmosphere grew thick with tension. That unmistakable feeling when everyone senses danger but doesn't quite understand what they're witnessing. I was close enough now to hear fragments of what the tall man was saying, something about following instructions and making this easy for everyone. Then the moment I'd been dreading happened. The tall man slowly withdrew something from his jacket pocket. Not a gun or knife, but a small rectangular device about the size of a smartphone, with several wires protruding from one end and what looked like a digital display. He held it at chest level, making sure the flight attendant could see it clearly while his partner moved to block any potential escape route toward the back of the plane. The attendant's face went pale, her professional composure cracking as she realized what she was looking at. Other passengers began to notice the commotion, some standing up to get a better view, others instinctively shrinking back in their seats. The cabin filled with nervous murmurs and the sound of people shifting uncomfortably. I could feel the collective anxiety building, that moment when a routine flight transforms into everyone's worst nightmare. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was it a real explosive device, an elaborate hoax, or something else entirely? The device looked crude, but potentially functional, with those exposed wires and what appeared to be a timer or detonator. In my years as an air marshal, I'd seen plenty of fake devices used by desperate people seeking attention, but I'd also encountered the real thing. The problem was, at 30,000 feet, you can't afford to guess wrong. The flight attendant was trying to remain calm, speaking in measured tones while slowly backing toward the cockpit, probably hoping to alert the pilots without escalating the situation. But the two men matched her movement, maintaining their positions and keeping that device visible. The shorter one finally spoke up, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent cabin. "Nobody needs to get hurt here. We just need everyone to stay calm and listen very carefully to what we're about to tell you." That's when I made my move. 3 years of retirement hadn't dulled my reflexes, and I knew this was my only window before the situation spiraled completely out of control. I approached from their blind spot, using the beverage cart as cover, and managed to get within arm's reach before either of them noticed me.
"Federal Air Marshal," I announced firmly, even though it wasn't technically true anymore. The psychological effect was immediate. Both men spun toward me, momentarily confused and off balance. In that split second of hesitation, I lunged forward and grabbed the device from the tall man's grip while simultaneously tackling him backward into the galley area. The shorter man started to react, but the male flight attendant had recovered enough to help restrain him.
What followed was 30 seconds of pure chaos. Passengers screaming, people diving under seats, the device skittering across the floor as we wrestled for control. When the dust settled and we had both men subdued, I finally got a close look at their explosive device. It was a GPS tracker jury-rigged with some LED lights and loose wires to look threatening, sophisticated enough to fool terrified civilians, but obviously fake to anyone with training. The whole thing had been an elaborate ruse, part of some insurance fraud scheme where they planned to claim trauma compensation after heroically disarming their own fake bomb. The tall man broke down completely once he realized his plan had failed, sobbing about medical bills and desperation. We made an emergency landing in Kansas City, where real federal agents took over and arrested both men. The reunion in Vegas was pretty anticlimactic after that, but my old colleagues got a kick out of hearing how I'd tackled a fake terrorist with a phony bomb. Sometimes the job really never leaves you, even when you think you've left it behind. The thing about being 10 years old is that you trust adults way too easily. I learned that lesson the hard way on a Friday afternoon at LaGuardia Airport, and honestly, it still gives me chills thinking about what could have happened. My parents had been divorced for about 2 years by then, and my mom had moved out to California for her job at some tech company. Every few months, my older brother Tyler and I would fly out there to spend time with her. Tyler was 15 and acted like he knew everything about everything, which I guess made me feel safe when we traveled together. The routine was always the same. We'd catch the early flight, Tyler would buy us overpriced airport food with the money Dad gave him, and we'd sit near our gate playing games on his phone until boarding time. That particular day started out exactly like all the others, except it was the first time Tyler had forgotten to charge his phone before we left home. We'd already checked in and made it through security without any problems. Our gate was at the far end of Terminal C, and Tyler was getting antsy because his phone was down to like 5% battery. I remember him looking around frantically until he spotted one of those charging stations near the food court. The area was pretty busy with people coming and going, dragging their suitcases and looking stressed about their flights. Tyler told me to sit right there on this metal bench next to the charging station while he went to grab us some snacks from the Hudson News store about 50 feet away. He could see me the whole time, he said, and he'd be back in 5 minutes tops. I wasn't worried at all. Airports always felt safe to me with all the security cameras and uniformed people walking around. I just sat there swinging my legs and watching people rush past with their carry-on bags, completely oblivious to the fact that someone had been watching me. Maybe 3 minutes had passed when this man approached me. He was tall, probably in his 40s, wearing a crisp navy blue suit with a white dress shirt and a tie that had these tiny airplane patterns on it. His hair was perfectly combed back with some kind of gel, and he had this really clean-shaven look that reminded me of the businessmen you see in commercials. What struck me most was how polished he appeared. His shoes were so shiny they reflected the fluorescent airport lights, and his briefcase looked expensive, like something my dad would carry to important meetings. He walked up to me with this confident stride, the kind that made him seem official and important. When he got closer, I noticed he had a badge clipped to his jacket pocket, though I couldn't really read what it said from where I was sitting. At 10 years old, a badge meant authority to me, and I automatically assumed he worked there. "Excuse me, sweetie," he said in this really smooth, professional voice. "I'm with airport security, and I need to ask you a few questions." He showed me the badge more clearly, holding it out so I could see it had some kind of official-looking seal on it. The badge looked real enough to me. It had his photo and everything, though the lighting made it hard to read the fine print. He knelt down to my eye level, which my parents had always taught me was what trustworthy adults did when they talked to kids. "We're doing a routine security check on unattended minors today. It's a new policy since some incidents last month." His voice had this caring, concerned tone that reminded me of my elementary school principal. "I need to take you to our office for just a few minutes to fill out some paperwork. Where are your parents?" The way he asked seemed genuinely worried, like he was trying to help me, and I remember feeling a little embarrassed that Tyler had left me alone when apparently there were new rules about that. I pointed toward the Hudson News store and explained that my brother was getting us snacks and would be right back. The man nodded seriously and said that was fine, but policy was policy, and we needed to handle this right away before my flight. "It'll only take a few minutes, and then you can come right back here to wait for your brother," he assured me. He stood up and gestured toward a corridor that led away from the main terminal area. "Our security office is just down this hallway. We'll have you back before your brother even realizes you're gone." The way he said it made it sound so routine and normal, like getting called to the principal's office at school. Not fun, but nothing scary either. I remember glancing back toward the store where Tyler was, but I couldn't see him through the crowd of people. The man seemed to notice my hesitation and smiled this reassuring smile. "Don't worry, honey. This happens all the time. We just need to make sure you're safe and that everything's in order with your travel documents." Something weird started happening in my stomach as I stood up, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly bothered me. Maybe it was how quickly he wanted to move, or how he kept looking around while he talked to me, like he was checking to see if anyone was watching us. His hand touched my shoulder as he started to guide me toward that hallway, and I noticed his palm felt sweaty through my t-shirt. The corridor he was leading me toward was definitely less crowded than the main area, and it seemed to stretch back into a part of the airport I'd never seen before. Most of the people walking around were coming from the opposite direction, toward the gates and food court, not going where we were headed. "Is the office very far?" I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. He squeezed my shoulder a little tighter and said, "Just a little ways." "You're being such a good cooperative girl." The compliment should have made me feel better, but instead it made that weird feeling in my stomach get stronger. We'd only walked maybe 20 feet when this janitor appeared from around the corner, pushing one of those big yellow mop buckets on wheels. He was an older black man, probably in his 60s, wearing a dark green uniform with patches that said LaGuardia Maintenance on them. His name tag read Jerome in faded letters, What I remember most about him was his eyes. They were really kind but also sharp, like he noticed everything going on around him. When he saw us, he slowed down, and his expression changed completely. It wasn't dramatic or anything, but there was this subtle shift in how he looked at the situation. The man with me immediately straightened up, and his grip on my shoulder loosened just a bit. "Afternoon," Jerome said politely to the man, but his eyes stayed focused on me. "Everything all right here, sweetie?" The way he asked made it clear he was really asking me, not the man. I felt this surge of relief that I couldn't explain, like when a teacher shows up right when kids are picking on you at recess. The man in the suit cleared his throat and tried to maintain that professional tone he'd been using with me. "Just doing a routine security check on this young lady. Nothing to worry about." But Jerome wasn't buying it, and I could tell. He positioned his mop bucket in a way that kind of blocked the hallway, making it impossible for us to keep walking without going around him. "Security check, huh?" Jerome said, and I noticed he pulled out his radio from his belt. "That's interesting. I've been working these terminals for 12 years, and I've never seen airport security dress quite like that." His voice was still polite, but there was steel underneath it now. The man's hand started to slide off my shoulder, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "What department did you say you were with again?" Jerome asked, stepping closer to us. The man mumbled something about being new and having to get back to his rounds, but Jerome wasn't having any of it. "Why don't we just call this in to make sure everything's proper?" he said, lifting his radio. "Control, this is Jerome in Terminal C. I've got a situation here that needs verification." The moment Jerome reached for his radio, everything changed. The man who'd been so calm and professional suddenly became agitated, like a switch had been flipped. "That won't be necessary," he said quickly, his voice losing that smooth quality it had before. "I just remembered I have another call I need to respond to first." He let go of my shoulder completely and started backing away from us, his briefcase clutched tightly against his chest. Jerome wasn't having any of it, though. "Hold on there, friend. Let's just get this sorted out properly." But the man was already turning around, walking fast toward the main terminal area. Not running exactly, but moving with this urgent, panicked energy that made my heart start racing. Jerome spoke into his radio again, describing the man's appearance and direction. Blue suit, white shirt, airplane tie, brown briefcase, heading toward the main concourse. Then he turned to me with the gentlest expression. "Honey, I need you to stay right here with me until we figure this out, okay? Can you tell me where your family is?" I was shaking now, not from cold, but from finally understanding that something really bad had almost happened to me. Jerome kept talking to me in this calm, reassuring voice while we waited for security to arrive. "You did good, sweetie. You followed your instincts." But honestly, I hadn't followed any instincts. I'd been ready to go with that man until Jerome showed up. Within minutes, 2 real airport security officers came jogging up to us, and I could immediately tell the difference. Their uniforms were completely different, with official LaGuardia patches and proper badges that looked nothing like what the man had shown me. They asked me to describe exactly what happened while one of them radioed for additional officers to search for the fake security guy. Tyler came running over about 5 minutes later, looking panicked and guilty. He'd finally noticed I wasn't at the charging station and had been frantically searching the food court area. When I told him what happened, his face went completely white, and he kept apologizing over and over, like it was his fault that some creep had tried to trick me. The security officers took us to their actual office, which was nothing like the vague office the fake guy had described. It was brightly lit, filled with monitors showing camera feeds from all over the airport, and had multiple uniformed personnel working at desks covered with official paperwork. They explained that they needed to review the security footage and file a report, but first they wanted to get our parents on the phone. Tyler called Dad while I sat in a chair that was way too big for me, still trying to process what had just happened. Dad drove straight to the airport, a 2-hour trip that he made in about 90 minutes, and we ended up missing our flight to California. While we waited, the security team pulled up the footage from the cameras near the charging station, Watching it back was surreal, like seeing a movie of myself almost getting kidnapped. The man had been lingering in the area for almost 10 minutes before approaching me, clearly watching and waiting for the right moment when Tyler was out of sight. What made everything even more terrifying was what they discovered when they ran his image through their system. The badge he'd shown me was a complete fake, a pretty convincing one, but fake nonetheless. Even worse, when they checked their entry logs, they found that he'd used a forged employee badge to get past the security checkpoint without a boarding pass. He wasn't a passenger, wasn't an employee, and had no legitimate reason to be in the secure area of the airport at all. The real kicker was that this wasn't his first time doing this. They found footage of him in the terminal on 3 other occasions over the past month, always near areas where families with children congregated. They never caught him that day. He'd slipped out through some service exit before they could track him down. Jerome became kind of a hero in our family after that. Dad insisted on getting his contact information so we could send him a proper thank you gift, and Jerome just smiled and said he was glad he happened to be mopping that particular hallway at that particular time. Still think about that day whenever I'm in airports, and I always make sure to stay close to whoever I'm traveling with, no matter how old I get. It was the kind of layover that drags just long enough to dull your brain. Mid-afternoon, fluorescent lighting, and overpriced sandwiches wrapped like museum exhibits. I was flying back from a work seminar in Tulsa and had a 3-hour gap at DFW before my connection. I work in software logistics, nothing dramatic, but I tend to record things, airport delays, odd announcements, even the occasional luggage mishap, mostly out of boredom. That day I had my phone propped against my coffee cup, idly recording planes landing through the wide terminal window. One particular landing caught my attention before anything even happened. The plane looked wrong in the air, not broken, not on fire, but sluggish, like it was gliding in too heavy, dipping slightly to one side. It hit the runway too hard, bounced once, then skidded with a sound I can only describe as metal being grated through wet concrete. People stood up all around me, some gasping, others recording. The plane veered off the strip and tore through the safety lights before slamming nose first into a chain-link fence near the service road. The tail lifted slightly, then dropped. Everything froze after that. Emergency vehicles rushed in within seconds. You could see the personnel pouring out like ants from every direction. Yellow vests, flashing lights, fire extinguishers, stretchers. But what unsettled me wasn't the crash. It was the people. One by one, passengers started emerging from the plane, but they weren't yelling, crying, or even rushing. They walked slowly, glassy-eyed, like they'd just wandered out of a funeral. No one collapsed. No one clung to anyone. They just stood there, pale, blinking too slowly, not even reacting to the responders shouting instructions. The news stations looped it for hours later that night. Minor landing gear failure, they called it. No serious injuries. A textbook emergency response. They even praised the pilot, but it kept gnawing at me. I couldn't stop thinking about how quiet the passengers were, how they moved like they were underwater. That's not how people act after a near-death experience. I've been on rough flights before, turbulence, emergency landings, and people always yell, pray, hug, cry. This was different. It felt off, but not in a way I could explain without sounding like a conspiracy nut. That night, holed up in the hotel near the airport, I went through the clips I'd recorded. Most of it was shaky, lots of crowd noise, people pointing, someone yelling for their kid. But there was a moment, right as the plane stopped moving, where the camera caught a clear view of the cabin through the broken fuselage. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. You could see a few rows of seats, the emergency lights flickering inside, and figures starting to rise slowly, some shielding their eyes from the sun glaring through the cracks. I almost deleted the clip right there. But something in the frame made me pause. There was a man, or at least a silhouette of one, seated near the middle window, perfectly still. Everyone else was moving, however sluggishly, but not him. He didn't flinch when the responders climbed aboard, didn't turn when a firefighter passed right by his seat, He just sat there, hands on his lap, facing straight ahead. Not asleep, not unconscious, just waiting. And even though the resolution wasn't great, I could swear his eyes were open. The part that really messed with me was that he never got off. I scrubbed through every angle I had, even checked local news footage, trying to spot him among the passengers gathered by the ambulances. Nothing. No one matching his shape, his clothes, his stillness. It's like he was never part of the evacuation. And no one mentioned him. Not the reporters, not the airline statements. They listed every passenger as accounted for. But I know what I saw. Or at least what my camera saw. Someone stayed behind. Voluntarily, it seemed. I showed the video to the woman at the front desk the next morning while checking out. She barely looked at it before handing my phone back, muttering something about how people freeze in emergencies. But that wasn't freezing. That was composure. The kind of stillness you see in statues or people waiting for a train, not an erect plane that just plowed through fencing. He wasn't reacting because somehow it didn't apply to him. And the more I thought about it, the more I started wondering if maybe he wasn't reacting because he wasn't meant to leave. Back home I kept digging, not obsessively, at least not at first, but enough to know something didn't add up. I found a press release that listed the flight number, the arrival time, and even a crew photo. But there was no manifest available to the public. I emailed the airline asking about the total passenger count and received a generic reply about privacy protocols. When I asked specifically whether anyone had remained on board or been injured in the cabin during the evacuation, they stopped responding altogether. I uploaded the clip anonymously to a small subreddit that specializes in analyzing strange footage. It didn't take long for a few people to comment on the guy I'd noticed. One user even tried to enhance the image, but the frame just got grainier. No one could identify a face. But someone else claimed they remembered a different incident, a crash landing in another state years back, where a figure had also been seen remaining in the cabin, silent, unmoving. I don't know if they were messing with me or if there's something more to it, but that comment stuck with me. For a while, I stopped flying altogether. I took trains when I could, drove more than I should, but a few months ago I had to fly again for work. A short trip, nothing dramatic. Right before takeoff, I glanced out the window and watched another plane taxiing to the gate across the tarmac. And for just a second, I thought I saw him. Same posture, same seat by the window, same stillness. But when I blinked, the plane had already started moving again and the angle was gone. Could have been nothing, could have been anyone. I don't show the footage anymore. People either shrug it off or make jokes about ghosts and time loops. I get it. It's easier to laugh than sit with the possibility that maybe we don't understand everything that walks off those planes, or what stays behind. But I still have the clip saved in a folder labeled MISC on my hard drive. I don't know who that man was. I don't know if he was alive, dead, or something in between. All I know is that every passenger was declared safe, and not a single soul acknowledged the one who never left. The flight was supposed to be routine. I'd flown out of Raleigh plenty of times for work, but that morning had a weird energy I couldn't quite place. It was early spring, still chilly enough to need a jacket, and the terminal was buzzing with the usual mess. Rolling suitcases, crying babies, and that hollow-sounding intercom that always cut off the first word. I was heading to a conference in Salt Lake City, something I wasn't exactly excited for. But I'd prepped well, and my hotel had decent reviews. I was just hoping to survive the networking mixers without faking too many laughs. I got to security later than I liked. My Uber driver missed the exit and looped around twice. The line was long, winding back near the coffee kiosk, and as I pulled out my ID and boarding pass, I noticed a man shuffle up behind me. Average height, scruffy beard, gray windbreaker with a busted zipper. He looked like the kind of guy you'd see refilling the chip rack at a gas station. At first he just hummed quietly, like he had a song stuck in his head. But then he tried to make small talk. Something about how long the line was, how TSA was always on a power trip. I gave a polite nod and turned forward, hoping he'd get the hint. He didn't. He kept finding little ways to chime in. "Headed somewhere fun?" he asked as I slipped off my shoes. I pretended not to hear him and focused on the bins. When I stepped through the scanner and went to grab my bag, he was right there again. Too close. Like, no personal space kind of close. I let him pass and lingered by a vending machine until he walked off toward a gate. I told myself it was nothing. Just a socially awkward guy who didn't know how to read signals. Still, something about his eyes, the way they darted from my face to my hands to my phone screen, stuck with me. Boarding time came, and I found my seat, window, row 18. I stashed my laptop bag, sat down, and pulled out my Kindle. I was halfway through a true crime book, which in hindsight might have been a mistake. Then I heard it, a voice right behind me. "Looks like we're neighbors." I didn't even need to turn around. Same voice from security. I glanced back, and there he was, settling into the seat directly behind mine, stuffing his windbreaker into the overhead like he owned the whole row. My stomach did this slow twist. Not panic exactly, but that tight, alert feeling you get when something clicks into place and you wish it hadn't. I tried to pretend I didn't notice him. Put my headphones on, didn't even start music, just wanted a barrier. But about 20 minutes into the flight, he started tapping the back of my seat. Not a hard tap, but rhythmic, like he was thinking through his fingers. I paused my audiobook and looked back. He was staring at the screen in front of him, pretending to scroll through movie options. When he saw me watching, he smiled like I'd caught him doing something cute. "Sorry," he said, not actually sounding sorry. "Didn't mean to bug you." I forced a tight smile and turned around, but I knew that wasn't going to be the end of it. He started whispering things under his breath after that. I couldn't catch everything, just fragments. My name, the city I was flying to. At first I told myself maybe I'd heard wrong, but then I heard my hotel name. That wasn't normal. I hadn't said it aloud. I hadn't even mentioned where I was staying to anyone, not out loud, not in a call. I didn't know how he knew. I turned fully around and asked him point blank, "Do I know you from somewhere?" He shrugged like I'd just asked him the weather and said, "We're just on the same path. Funny how things line up, huh?" I didn't answer. I buzzed for the flight attendant and asked to move seats, but the plane was full. She offered me a drink on the house. That was it. The rest of the flight, I kept my screen tilted low and tried to keep my eyes forward, but I saw his phone more than once, tilted toward the aisle. The front camera blinked at me twice. I didn't say anything. I didn't even want to breathe in his direction. I sat completely still and watched the seatbelt light like it was my lifeline. When we finally started descending, I told myself I'd let everyone else off first. No way I was getting caught in that weird shuffle where he could end up behind me again. But as soon as the plane hit the tarmac and people stood up, he was already grabbing his bag and blocking the aisle, like he was making sure I couldn't sneak past. I stayed seated, watched people file out, waited until he was almost out of sight, then moved fast. I thought maybe if I took the opposite path through the terminal, stopped at a bathroom or a bookstore, I'd lose him. For a while I didn't see him, and I started to feel stupid for how paranoid I'd gotten. But when I made it to the rideshare pickup area and scanned the crowd, there he was, off to the side near the column, pretending to mess with his phone. Same jacket, same dead-eyed look, now staring right at me like we had unfinished business. I didn't even think. I turned and walked straight to the first airport staffer I could find, a woman in a red blazer holding a clipboard near the baggage carts. I didn't try to explain much at first. I think my words came out tangled, but I must have looked shaken enough because she took me seriously right away. She asked me to point him out, and when I turned back around, he was gone. My heart sank, but she stayed calm and called someone on her radio. Within 2 minutes, airport security showed up. 2 men, one with a clipboard, the other with a scanner on his hip. I repeated everything as clearly as I could this time, and they asked if I'd be willing to come with them to review footage. I said yes without hesitation. I wanted this to be over. I wanted him to be caught or at least scared off. We didn't even need to look at the footage. While we were still at the office near the terminal's back corridor, one of the officers got a call. Someone matching my description of him had been spotted loitering near the rental car counters. They brought him in. I wasn't allowed to see the whole exchange, but I did hear a bit when they questioned him in the next room. The strange part, the part that still sticks with me, is that he didn't seem frantic or embarrassed. He was calm, too calm. He even asked for water, like this wasn't a confrontation, like he thought he'd done nothing wrong. The officer who spoke with me came back later and sat down with this strange look on his face. He told me they'd gone through the man's phone. He gave it up without a fight. Inside were screenshots, my flight confirmation, a map with the terminal layout, and my hotel reservation email, right down to the check-in code. I stared at him like he was making it up. I had no idea how the guy got those. I hadn't shared that itinerary with anyone but my assistant. My phone had never left my bag. It felt like some invisible wall between my private life and the outside world had cracked open without me noticing. They didn't arrest him. That's the part that still frustrates me. Since he hadn't technically done anything illegal, they said the photos weren't explicit. The screenshots didn't prove he hacked anything. They just gave him a formal warning and put him on a no-fly list pending investigation. They offered me an airport escort to the hotel, which I took. I changed rooms that night, canceled the rest of the conference, and flew back the next morning on a different airline. Nothing's happened since then. But I still check behind me at the terminal. Every time I fly, I scan the line at security like I'm flipping through a deck of cards, hoping not to see his face again.